Now that we're familiar with the various parts of a cell, we need to talk about how cells work together in groups. Each cell is equipped with a nucleus, which has the entire owner's manual, so to speak, in the form of its DNA code. And it spells out specifically what this cell is going to do throughout its lifetime. But initially, all cells are in a generic form, and they haven't really matured into being able to do one thing or another. And so a group of cells which mature into, or what we'll call differentiate into, a certain type of cell, they can work together to form the various parts of the plant, such as leaves or parts of a flower or roots. We call these groups of cells tissues, and there's two main types of tissues that we're concerned with. The first is referred to as meristematic tissue, and as it says in your notes, this contains actively dividing cells. These cells are considered to be immature. Okay, in other words, they have not developed into any one particular sort of specialty, and these are also referred to as undifferentiated. Okay, that means they are still generic cells, so to speak. On the other hand, permanent tissue contains cells that are no longer dividing, and they start to specialize. They start to turn into various types of cells, root cells, for example, or epidermal cells in a leaf. And so these have matured, we can say, and they are also said to have been differentiated. So meristematic tissue immature, permanent tissue matured. So therefore, all permanent tissues at one point were meristematic tissues. So now let's talk about the various types of meristematic tissues, and we're going to start off with talking about meristems that occur in the shoots or the above ground portions of the plant. And luckily for us, meristems are named based on where they occur. And so first we're going to start talking about what are referred to as a shoot meristem. These shoot meristems are buds, we often refer to them as, will eventually become most commonly leaves, but they can also take on modified leaf forms, most notably flowers, which allows them to reproduce sexually, and flowers, if successful, will produce some sort of fruit containing the seeds. This is a photograph of a cross section of the tip of a shoot on a plant called coleus, and this is a plant that's very commonly used in Florida as what we call a bedding plant for adding seasonal color or flower beds, let's say, to a landscape. And the various parts here we need to label. At the very tip is the apical meristem. We call it the apical meristem because it is at the tip of the shoot. This is the outermost meristem or growth region on this shoot. We say apex of a mountain is the peak of the mountain. Well, the peak of the shoots is called the apical meristem. And down here you'll see what are referred to as subapical meristems. There's one there. There's one right here. These are leaves, as are these right here, underdeveloped leaves. This apical meristem is important in that it directs the growth of the entire shoot, or at least of the shoot in its immediate area. And what it actually does is it influences chemically these subapical meristems and keeps them from growing. And so we can write that down. The apical meristem suppresses the growth of the subapical meristems. So this is the basic structure of how a shoot grows. We've got cell division going on in these meristems here, here, and here. However, the apical meristem continually grows, and as it grows outward, it puts down layers of cells behind it. You can see they're very small in this area, but they start to get larger and larger the further back in the stem you go. At this point, these cells up in here are undifferentiated. Once again, we're talking about meristems here. However, further back into the stem, these cells start to mature and they start to become various types of tissues like leaves. And you can see here the beginnings of the veins of these leaves, and we refer to those as vascular tissues. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. So this is the basic structure. Apical meristem followed by subapical meristems with their leaves that accompany them. The next type of meristem that we're going to be talking about are root meristems. And guess where they're found? They're found underground. They're part of the roots. The root meristems, for the most part, are found at the tips of the root. And this is what a root tip looks like. We've got this region here that is rounded off. Right here you can see this very dense packing of these little dark spots. Those spots are actually the nuclei of the cells in here. And they're packed very closely together because there's a lot of cells there and they're actively dividing. So this region right in here is what we would refer to as the actual root meristem. And so these cells are rapidly dividing. They divide, and as they do, they lay down layers of cells in this direction, which pushes the rest of these cells forward. But they're also growing cells in the direction of the tip. These cells out in here form a layer of protective cells, or a protective root cap, and that's what this is referred to as, the root cap. And again, it is basically there to protect the root meristem. So we'll say protects the root meristem. Well, what is it protecting it from? Well, the soil is very abrasive. You know, sandpaper is made out of particles of soil, or particles of sand, or at least sand size or sand-like particles. And so as abrasive as sandpaper is, the soil is equally abrasive. And these cells, remember, we're not talking about cells with thick bark layers or anything like that. They've just got a cell membrane and a cell wall to protect the inner parts of the cell. And so as this root pushes forward through the soil, the root cap is constantly being worn away. And so the root meristem here has to continually replace the root cap as it grows and pushes forward through the soil. Now, roots and shoots in plants that live for longer than one season, they not only need to grow outward, they need to increase in diameter, or increase in girth. And they do this through the use of what we call lateral meristems. In other words, instead of growing forwards, they increase the diameter, as it's stated in your notes. If we take a look at a lateral meristem in a woody plant cross section, here we go. This is a cross section of basswood, which is a tree in the genus Tilia. And if we look here, we can see there's all sorts of cells. But right here in this region, you see that there are some very tightly packed cells, and this is a lateral meristem. In the stems, we refer to this as a cambium layer, and it is growing cells inward, which pushes the actual cambium and the growth outward, increasing diameter. And so in the outward direction, these cells get compressed and they actually form, come here so we can read it, bark. And in this direction, they're forming what are called vascular tissues. Vascular tissues carry sap and water to various portions of the plant. And in this woody type plant, you can start to see the development of rings, and these rings, as you probably heard before, a tree puts down a new ring of growth every year. The way that it does that is through this lateral meristem, and these cells divide. When they move away from the meristem, they differentiate into these vascular tissues and forming what we call the actual wood of the tree. And in the outer direction, they compress and they form the bark layer.